Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody got their lunch of choice and are happy with your choice. It's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for our luncheon period here. August Cole is a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He's director of the Art of Future War project, which explores narrative fiction and visual media for insight into the future of conflict. His fiction writing tackles themes at the core of American foreign policy and national security in the 21st century, including the privatization of military and intelligence operations and the future of American power in the Pacific. A former defense writer, he is co-author with Peter Singer of the 2015 techno-thriller Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War. He holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in public administration from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. So let's give a strong welcome to August Cole.
Hello, everybody. I hope that if the mids here learn one thing, if you read fiction, you get free pizza and you get out of formation. So thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be speaking to a group like this, to also have the Naval Institute supporting the work of fiction writers, both through its press, as it did back when Tom Clancy was breaking out, but also more recently in the consideration of what great power conflict might look like in the 21st century. The quote up here, I think, is apt in the context of what we're going to be talking about today, and in many ways has been a defining part of how I've tried to think about the work we've been doing at the Atlantic Council and my own writing in the last few years. Narrative and fiction are incredibly useful and important for stretching our imaginations, for testing our boundaries, and really checking our assumptions. Trying to understand what might come true and why is actually a lot harder than we often give it credit. You know, many of the tools that we use to try to figure out the future, to try to even understand the world around us because it's changing so fast, they aren't working very well right now. And so we have an opportunity that's been developing, really, to create space for new voices. Some of the comments at the closing of the prior panel from Dr. Allison, calling this really a time for strategic imagination, that really hit home with me. More so, the extension of an invitation for new voices, new perspectives, new practices and ways of thinking, that is spot on. And we're now at a point where a video game director can be a fellow at the Atlantic Council, where a novelist can speak to a professional military audience, not only in the US, but around the world, with the kind of credibility and connection that hopefully expands minds, allows some conversations about uncomfortable truths, and better yet, gets towards something like a solution to some of those really, really difficult things that we discovered through our fiction. So as has been said, I'm the author of Ghost Fleet with Pete Singer. This is a novel that came out 3 years ago that really did try to think the unthinkable. I have a nonfiction background as a journalist. It was a big leap to literally push all that behind me and start to embark on this journey of using narrative, using character-driven perspectives to understand what was coming down the pike. For my co-writer, Pete Singer, too, an esteemed think tanker futurist, both of us really felt that fiction was going to be the best way to talk about a really big thing in the room that no one wanted to address or confront, which was the rise of China. We started working on this at a time when, of course, counterinsurgency and counterterrorism were absorbing a lot of bandwidth, a lot of budget, a lot of priority, and a lot of coverage. There were moments even when we were working on the Ghost Fleet in its most bare bones that we wondered if people might literally laugh at us for writing about war with China. And yet here we are. We started off working on the book 2013, 2014, the centennial of the start of the Great War, as has been said earlier today. And yet we're here in 2018, which would be the cessation of it next month. And we've seen a sea change in many cases in how we think about the U.S.'s strategic place in the world and China's role in that. Part of what we were trying to do with Ghost Fleet was to tell a story like Tom Clancy did in 1986 with Red Storm Rising. That was a fiction book that came out in a year when I was about 12 years old and really trying to make sense of the Cold War, make sense of the world as it was. And I devoured that book literally in a day or two. I think it was the middle of the summer. And my co-writer had the same reaction. And when I meet people today who say, oh, Ghost Fleet kept me up all night, I had to finish it, it's the best kind of feedback a writer can get because it speaks to that power of our imagination to try to consider the sorts of futures, the sorts of environments, the sorts of operating parameters out there that don't necessarily align with how we want the world to be, but how it might actually be. And so this moment when we're looking to fiction, when we're looking to the kinds of narratives to understand not just technology and what it might look like, we're also trying to understand the human aspects of conflict. There is, of course, an enduring conversation about whether the character or nature of warfare is changing. And I think there's also a parallel track conversation that needs to happen about how technology and other global trends are changing us as humans. This will happen in a very literal sense, is underway, in fact, right now, as those of us who have those haptic twitches from our vibrating phones or watches can experience when they're not in our pockets, to biomodification for school performance and things that are coming down the pike in the next decade, whether we want them to or not. The importance of narrative is something that is appreciated more and more because it takes us outside of what we know and what we're comfortable with. This is a scene from San Francisco down at Crissy Field below Fort Mason, which is one of the most beautiful spots in America, I think. And having been born in San Francisco and lived there and spent a lot of time during the dot-com boom there in the 90s, it was a really interesting thought experiment to consider San Francisco as a wartime town. It's a strategically vital area, not in the way we talk about it today because of its technology, but because of its physical location, the protected bay. But reimagining as it was in the 1940s in a 21st century context is just one example of the kind of world that we were trying to take people into in creating Ghost Fleet, a novel that explored, like Tom Clancy did, these perspectives of global conflict from a myriad point of view. It's not enough to try to understand the future of fighting, the future of conflict from your own perspectives. It's incumbent upon professional military, upon analysts, upon futurists to have as open in mind as possible to really seeing the world from these other points of view, and particularly an adversary perspective. And so a scene like this, I think, is really inspiring to me when I'm trying to create these kinds of worlds because you have a piece of military equipment that's so out of character with San Francisco today, for those of you who've been there recently, although it is Fleet Week, I believe, right now, to see something like this landing on Crissy Field. But what if this was par for the course? What if there was an anti-missile battery parked back out on Hawk Hill across the bay in Marin? These are the kinds of small details that in writing fiction you can start to do so that when we think the unthinkable, we're not doing so in an analytical and in a dry way that doesn't really connect with anybody. And so this is part of what Ghost Fleet did. It's part of the reason why it's on professional military reading lists, why we've been able to be afforded opportunities like this to make the case that fiction can be useful. It's part of the work that we've done through the Atlantic Council and the Art of the Future project, and Art of Future Warfare project, to really start to consider these big macro trends and what they might actually look like, not in a white paper report, which one of our fellows named Max Brooks, who's the author of World War Z, calls printed ambient. So a novel can do something which is far more engaging and far more evocative of the future as it might be. And that's an incredibly important theme for us, I think, to pick up on when we're trying to do something as difficult as imagining what a great power conflict might look like, and who might we be fighting? Would China and Russia be aligned or not? In Ghost Fleet, we posit that they would. And in fact, through a bit of subterfuge to create strategic surprise through an alliance that looks like it's fraying, but it's in fact cementing. And using that sort of a deception to achieve the sort of grandiose effect that a strategist today might consider as being highly improbable and unlikely, but yet from a Beijing point of view, from a Moscow point of view, is somewhat sensible to gamble, to risk, with the kind of payoff that you might have a century or 2-century tail to the strategic payoff to a decision like that. You know, if every strategic decision is in effect a sort of investment in national capital and national will, these kinds of calculations, they don't seem so crazy when you start to really spool them out and spin them forward into the future. I've been doing this now since I left the Wall Street Journal for about 8 years. And what I've been doing, 7 years, what I've been doing has been somewhat exploratory. You know, in the design thinking community, they talk about discovery activities. You know, people go and look for inspiration in all kinds of corners. You know, the methods that the creative community works are very different. Some people hang out in their sweatpants all day. Others are out in the world talking to folks to get that kind of stimulation. The idea that I had always pursued was that the work that I wanted to create that was made up would still be useful. We've called it useful fiction, which is what I would put Ghost Fleet in the category of, meaning you can read this book on the weekend and go to work Monday petrified and terrified about supply chain hardware vulnerabilities. That's actually an issue that has really resonated with a lot of the defense community on the industrial side and the government side, and has, of course, been rendered more acutely by recent reporting by Bloomberg and other outlets. The point is that you can really galvanize people around an idea and around a concept by using some of these approaches. And I do a lot of this instinctively, and that's difficult sometimes then to convey to a bigger audience or big organizations like an organized military. And so, though there will still be hopefully more creativity and more out-of-the-box thinking in the future, there is still going to be acronyms. So the way I kind of tried to approach this was to come up with a concept called FICINT, as you would have an open source intelligence strain, if you will, that uses fiction and intelligence. So perhaps as useful as ELINT or the other categories and classifications of information out there. And the idea behind this is that we can find inspiration in everyday content and media around us that is really a distillation of much of the complexities and nuance that ordinary analytical capabilities can't capture. The seriousness with which the creative community, many of them, approach understanding the future, and particularly the future of war, is as dedicated as anybody who might be in public service. There are people out there producing really, really detailed and fantastic visions of the future of conflict. And in fact, many of them are in the services themselves, as I'll discuss. The acronym, of course, breaks down like this: foresight, individuals, community, inspiration, nuance, and technology. And I feel like there is a lot of variability and a lot of wiggle room, if you will, to the kinds of makeups of an acronym like this. And so this may evolve, but this is where I am right now with it. And I think it's a really good encapsulation in trying to make sense in a linear way of the sort of process we're using to bring in elements that don't always fit together in considering the future of conflict, particularly something as really, really difficult to grasp as a great power conflict that could see old shipyards resurrected, the boneyard fleet out in the Southwest brought back to life, to see generations of ship welders brought into service alongside people who perhaps are biomodified or are digital natives of a kind that would even, I think, surprise those who are growing up with iPads in elementary school today. And so what I like about the framework is that when you think about foresight, and this is the F in FICINT, the value of it in the professional military domain is real. This is a cover of a Marine Corps warfighting lab document that some of you may have come across, that in effect is a short story annex to their futures strategic environment forecast. And what that's done is allowed people to sort of come at this vision, which is both original and synthetic from the warfighting lab, in a way that isn't going to be as perhaps dry as a regular analytical report. Now, for the wonks in the room, we can digest and devour these sorts of reports, but even then, I think we relate differently to the kinds of visions of the future that rely on our senses, that rely on the observations that we make, and insights that we develop through our own real-world experiences. There's more veracity, there's more actionable information, I think, and ideas around that when you start to produce them in a way that is tied to a structured and authoritative document. And so what we did here was we were able to work with the warfighting lab by convening a one-day workshop with a series of Atlantic Council fellows and participants. We had Marines and a few other service members join us. I think there were 19 in total, to spend a day workshopping, literally being, in effect, in a writer's room in 3 small teams to produce 3 stories that would go in this annex. And the organizational support that you've seen for this approach, which I really do think goes up to General Neller in the Marine Corps, was real. In fact, they even flew in an embassy guard from Cyprus, I believe, to the workshop for 24 hours, or maybe slightly less, because he'd made the cut when they sent out that all-MAR admin note to try to recruit potential writers and who could prove they had the chops to spend a day with Max Brooks, Chuck Gannon, another writer, myself. And what was really satisfying about this, it was not a fast process, though we did spend that really intense day over the next year seeing this take shape. And what was produced was really, I think, a very faithful rendering of how these service members themselves, bottom up, view the future. That aspect of crowdsourcing, which is a really important technology, if you want to call it that, I think can't be underestimated because it allows us to be able to work with people's perspectives that are not native to our own. So all the biases that we come with, which can be incredibly advantageous in trying to understand certain aspects of the future, can be, of course, limiting, and the worst part is when you don't realize it. The worst kind of failure of imagination is when you don't realize that you've actually missed something titanic. Another aspect of Fickint that I think is really important is to focus on individuals. And by what I mean here is the ability to put yourself literally in the shoes of somebody in an environment in the future. In a great power war with China context, as the panel previously alluded, we may see a national effort that is unprecedented. We may experience casualties as a nation or as a global society that are unprecedented. And so trying to understand what is that like. So I'm going to spoil a little bit of Ghost Sleep for those of you that haven't had a chance to read it. We deal with occupied Hawaii. And one of the things that I felt was really important in the book was to explore what would it look like to live in Honolulu, for example. What would it look like to be an American insurgent? What would it look like to read propaganda from Chinese occupying authorities? And so if you can see this, what this is the kind of poster you would see on a wall, glued up. You can't hack a analog poster like this. So as propaganda, I think you might actually see this as an art form, again, reemerging in a great power conflict. But what you might see here is the Chinese authorities making the case that America is better off not trying to retake Hawaii. And you can see the language, the visual imagery, evokes the sort of official messaging that we've seen, of course, throughout the 20th century, and I believe will actually be a feature in future conflict to come. And it speaks to really having a complex picture when it comes to information operations and psychological operations, but also just national will. What's worth fighting for, and why? Those are really fundamental questions that are very difficult to answer, but fiction can help us do so. As I mentioned, the printed Ambien is a difficult thing to distribute widely and have people read all the way to the end. But novels and other forms of entertainment like film can be incredibly effective. The idea that you can create a movie, this is Doug Liman's film, which depicts, of course, the US fight against aliens, this is The Edge of Tomorrow, with a really bewilderingly amazing array of technologies that we would recognize today. There's tilt rotors, exosuits. But what's fascinating about this movie is the way that we achieve an advantage over the adversary isn't by adding more firepower, but it's really through kind of out-innovating and outsmarting them. And I think that's also a really important lesson in thinking through what conflict will be like in the next 10 to 20 years. That mass, of course, and quantity do still matter, particularly as we start to look to attritable systems, unmanned capabilities that swarm in different scale. And of course, cyber is its own kind of offshoot to that. But at the same time, the society that's able to move quickly and iterate and do so at less internal cost, I mean that bureaucratically, not economically, is going to have a better shot at prevailing, especially as a conflict will not be short and sharp, as many people I think aspire to, but in fact be protracted, long, and quite terrible, to be honest. The idea of imagination, of course, and inspiration being central to the sorts of ideas that we have in everyday life here and can draw upon the sorts of solutions we develop, I think are really well illustrated by one of my favorite, it wasn't terribly broadly received, but it should be read more widely, a series that's called Engines of Extinction. It's a hybrid graphic novel with some really rich primary source material that I think is really worth reading because it speaks to China having an asymmetric strategic advantage that is literally unbeatable. And it asks that all-important question, well, then what? So you discover this sort of a disadvantage. What do you do about it? And this is exactly what this explores. And here is the sort of recruiting poster. You might see it like Fort Benning or Fort Bragg, for example, to join a unit that's being created with the Office of Asymmetric Advantage to combat that threat. So Engines of Extinction, you can get it on Amazon in e-format. It's incredibly valuable from this perspective of ideation and kind of creating concepts and ideas that can be useful in considering how to deal with an adversary that has such a technological investment track and that is only going to be increasing like China. Technology, of course, isn't just about binary, but it's really about gray areas. This is art from Google's Deep Dream AI. I have no idea what it is. It creeps me out, and that's why I put it up here, because it speaks to how much we don't know. If you, the Center for Naval Analyses has a really wonderful podcast called AI on AI with Andrea Lachinsky. It's one of the best to track as a layperson like myself, history major, some of these developments because it reveals how much is not known about some of the most marvelous and potentially beneficial technologies out there that we're creating, and yet those that have such great existential risk. And so this is a really good reminder that the nuance that different forms of fiction can draw out and that human experience in relating to an artificial intelligence, as Spike Jonze did in his film Her, as we've seen in books like Autonomous by Annalee Newitz about the relationship between a a warrior robot and his partner, which is incredibly complex, I think is a really, really valuable area to devote some time to. And if we don't, I think we risk being surprised in ways that we don't expect. Again, going back to the sorts of blind spots that we all inherently carry with technology. We can often see technology as a discrete, distinct platform, an F-35, a capability, offensive cyber, but yet not thinking about in the great power context what it is going to be like as a service member, as a civilian, to exist in that sort of world, in potentially a year-long, drawn-out sort of campaign, for example, against the Chinese in a global context. How are we going to get microchips and rare earths? What if there was a victory box outside of the elementary schools where kids could drop off their smart toys? What if the iPads that are cracked and half charged, lying in many of our kitchen drawers or under our beds, suddenly had strategic importance? Those small adjustments to our daily lives, which are actually speaking to quite profound disruptions, are really important to draw out and tease out because they can potentially speak to the kind of awareness in a broad sense in connecting people, but also in the kinds of solutions that might be able to afford us a little more resiliency, which I think is one of the most important things in this area of assumed vulnerability. Disruption, of course, is coming to the military too. The sorts of job dislocation that the, for example, truck driving industry is going to experience with automated driverless vehicles is going to be affecting motor transport operators, the 888Ms in the Army. Other sorts of replacement of human with technology, whether it's ground forces, air forces, sea forces, it's going to have an impact on the culture and traditions that we have come to know and understand and expect from our Western militaries. This is from an effort to fight BRAC down at Fort Benning a few years ago, but I think it's a really good reminder about how hard people will cling to traditional expressions of what a nation-state's armed forces are going to be like that will not align with the way that technology and investment and demographics are going. The sensorization of everything. Nobody laughed at this either. Nobody ever laughs at this slide, but I put it up here anyway. This is a bag of smart food, which is that really, really addictive, cheesy popcorn that gets all over your hands. We're going to be sensorizing food. We're going to be sensorizing the clothes we wear. We're going to be sensorizing each other. The amount of data that the Internet of Things is going to be producing is going to be extraordinary. Almost a fourth dimension, if you will, that will permit new layers of visibility, new avenues of vulnerability. A company like GE, which has been trying to get into this pretty heavily, is looking at like $60 trillion in investment in industrial IoT during the next decade and a half. 15 billion devices as of a year ago, maybe 70 billion in a decade, according to IHS. So the amount of data out there that an organized military is going to have to understand, that a government's going to have to understand, the private sector too, and decide what is off limits, what is fair game, what can be weaponized, particularly in the kinds of environments where much of the electromagnetic spectrum may be contested. What happens to this massive reservoir of insight out there? Will that be fought over? Will that be contested legally, economically, in the same way that we think about the digital commons today? I've been able to write a few short stories recently in the last year and a half, one of which was published in May, AUTOMATED VALOR, by the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings. I was very grateful for that, for the art they commissioned by Alex Brady. And I put it up because it also speaks to the larger kind of sea changes at work and the way we can use fiction to get at them. So ostensibly a story about a British Legion Air Force fighting the Chinese for control of the port of Djibouti. It's really about the question of who is the most charismatic person in your unit, and what if it's an AI? And who will be in an organized military in the late 2030s, and why will they fight? Will it be for e-citizenship, akin to what Estonia has today? Could the British Empire resurrect, for example, around a global digital citizenship that has as much economic as much as strategic relevance to anything going on in London? This next story that I was going to bring up was called Operation Candlemaker, which I wrote for the Atlantic Council's Art of the Future website. And it asked a really important question of when will we first use truly human off-the-loop AI capabilities? And this posits it is with Iran in the Gulf, Persian Gulf, because we have essentially confronted an area that is so unsafe for our surface warships that we've sent in a squadron of unmanned and aircraft together to use these pilotless ships, these crewless ships, as a casualty-free way of achieving a military objective. Given the lethality of the maritime environment, at increasing distance from home shores, we have to be, I think, ready for and considering the kinds of implications internally to the service, say the Navy, but also to what that means to our strategic posture and footprint out there. And I'd also mention, too, looking to the areas where conflict may kick off that we don't expect, the high north, the Arctic, thinking through the relationship that Russia has to that region and how can they use it for strategic advantage in a way when NATO, and particularly the US, have a fractured and contentious relationship. The ability to use the information domain with hybrid, commando, technology-infused units to affect really, really profound strategic change on the ground in a very small amount of time, I think is real, and that is actually a cycle that is only going to increase. If you think about it like an OODA loop, that's just going to keep constricting and constricting and constricting, where the obligation to orient, act, there will be no room for decision because that will have to be farmed out to a machine, more or less, to be able to get the kind of military results that a human would be too slow effectively to make. Again, the traffic jam. That's what we're trying to do with FICINT. That's what we've been trying to do with Ghost Fleet. How do we talk about the vulnerabilities in the cyber domain in our most important weapons systems? Ghost Fleet helped us do that. How do we talk about the future of the Chinese Communist Party in a why does that matter way? Because what happens with the party's consideration of the professionalizing military if they don't swear fealty to Xi Jinping in the next few years? Will the party make its 100th anniversary in, I believe, 2020? Obviously, China as a republic will hit its centennial in 2049, but the party itself as an entity of control is at a really critical phase right now. I think the gambit that they've placed upon social credit it speaks to that, but it's really a simplistic, I think, way to assume that that's their future. Rather, how they manage their industrial and technological focused industry, how they manage their professionalizing military that's going to have greater capital appetites. It's going to cost more, simply put, to field carriers and fifth-generation fighters, the same sorts of problems that we deal with in trying to consider how do we borrow our way to a strategic position of dominance when China may spend more on defense than us, let's say by the mid to late 2020s, when our interest payments on the debt will eclipse our DoD budget. So these are the sorts of kind of strategic realities that we're trying to come to grips with that hopefully fiction lets us do so in a way that isn't dry, that is engaging, that hopefully doesn't also induce despair. I'm a pretty dystopian person, but I'm also an optimist, which is an unusual combination. I hope that comes through in what I write, that I see a lot of the problems and stuff that can go wrong, but I also want to believe that we as individuals can do something about it. And that's many of you here in the room today that will be dealing with this, of course, through your careers. I want to transition to questions because I think it's important to have some dialogue back and forth. We've got about 18 minutes or so, and I would love to hear what you all think of the concepts and, of course, Ghost Fleet, et cetera. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the group. I appreciate the support for the kind of fiction work that I'm doing, but also other writers and groups out there. So let's go to Q&A. I want everybody to keep their questions no longer than a tweet. And I mean like the old tweets, 140 characters. That's a great question. The question was, I speak a lot in this presentation and in general to the problems of the future. Can I imagine the solutions? Before I answer, there are mics, by the way. There are just on the first balcony and then up for the mids on the second. I think one of the things that is the clearest path towards a solution is acknowledging that we have the power to fix the sorts of technological vulnerabilities that we've created through our desire to connect everything. And that comes through, I think, addressing it through resiliency. So if you start operating under the assumption that your network will be vulnerable and already is owned by your adversary, that has profound implications for how you operate militarily, but also what you do in peacetime. One of the solutions, I think, that doesn't really have a military-industrial aspect, to be honest, is political. The idea of our very divided nation right now going through a great power conflict scares me as much as the Chinese having a backdoor into a server from Amazon or Apple. The more we can do to invest in our own resiliency, and that is as much personal as it is community or political, to put it at a larger scale, I think speaks to what we're going to need to do that is difficult as a nation. It's easy to be weak, and I think that's often why empires have fallen. I think we have to think about our ability to do the hard work, what it takes to be strong. That could mean, of course, policy changes, things like being able to really articulate what it means to be the U.S. is a Pacific nation in the 21st century, alongside a rising China. but it also means re-examining our role in the world as we envision it from our own communities and individual lives here at home. I think all that fits together. From the defense industrial side, I believe the desire to use artificial intelligence and robotics is something that we're going to have to be more and more serious about, but do so in a way that's operationally effective and also keeps in mind the American values that go with laws of armed conflict, just war ethic. And I think those are compatible. I don't think we can avoid that. We're not going to be able to ban killer robots, so to speak, as a lot of people in the international community would like. That doesn't make sense. And I think the investment in prioritization on the Russian and Chinese side particularly, I think shows how potentially dangerous that could be to avoid that.
Sir, Midshipman Second Class Anik, when we reach the point where the performance of AI and unmanned technology is more effective than human performance, where do you see the future of the military going?
This is a really existential question that I think will have a changing answer, with every generation as we become more comfortable with different technologies. In Ghost Fleet, we tried to wrestle with the next 10-year version and really get at the question of what would it be like to fly alongside a robotic wingman. Would you trust the machine or not? Because trust is, of course, I think at the core of many of the relationships that we have with our devices and machines. Our awareness of vulnerabilities is growing. It's emerging in the popular press. It's emerging in a technological vulnerability context around the competition with China, of course. And so how much we trust different systems like the increasing autonomy. So we have very narrow AI today that can do a select number of things. As we see more and more capability growing, I think there will be a show me aspect to that will be paced a little bit by what do we trust. So the idea of investing in capabilities that allow a human to remain on the loop, I think is very appealing from a today perspective, but may not be very practicable from a tomorrow perspective. Because the speed of warfare, particularly in the cyber domain on offensive cyber, is going to be going so fast that it's going to be very difficult to pace what's happening. And that, of course, carries great strategic risk, where signals get crossed, machines, we've all had our devices fail us at the times, and they absolutely shouldn't. So again, back to that concept of resiliency being baked into that. I think once that begins to be part of the design philosophy and process, you're going to see, I think, a fairly rapid uptake on that. Because when you think about removing many of the technological impediments to robotics and autonomy, a lot of this is really cultural or ethical. And I think we can still, as I said, advance and propagate these technologies in the civilian world as much as in the military domain as we start to understand what the full spectrum of obligations that we have to one another as humans mean for how we employ these machines. I have a friend who works at a Boston area university, and we were having in kind of a technology context, and we were having a conversation about potential unemployment around AI. And it was really interesting because the way I approach it is not a fatalistic one, that we're not going to have any work to do in the future. But the work we do will be different fundamentally. And I think looking at a lot of those debates and how empowered we feel to say, we have a vote in how this, I don't mean quite literally politically yet, we will, but how we have a voice, if you will, that can be heard in this sort of debate and context and conversation. I think that's incredibly important too, to ensure that when we do get to those go, no-go points with certain technological capabilities, that we are ready to do so in a way that, again, that honors the kind of values we have as a nation, but also as an international community, because none of this happens in a vacuum. The story that I published with Proceedings was very much about understanding these questions from an allied point of view. Incredibly important, incredibly worth your time to try to seek out those perspectives. Question from up top.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cole. So one of the big differences between, let's say, us and China is the fact that we can have gatherings like this that are fairly open and pretty much anyone could walk in and have an opinion, whereas we see their strengths as more based on central planning. And we seem to think this kind of thing is really important to our advantage, like the Atlantic Council and the kind of gatherings you were talking about where you bring in people from different places and share different ideas. We think that gives us an advantage, but it doesn't seem like it has yet. Do you think it does?
I think I stand here in a nation that is technologically dominant globally currently, that is economically strong. And of course, looking at the rise of China and parity shows us that we're going to have to consider whether our system still makes sense in the 21st century when someone with a population, 4 times our size more or less, is presenting an alternative model, not just internally to their own citizens, but globally. But resolutely, I believe, yes, we have a way in our society of innovating, of developing companies, concepts, and ideas, of articulating what our national values are, that in a longer arc in the last 100 years, I think has incredible potential in the next 100 to do great good. I think we have to be careful not to be cynical about what we're able and not able to do. I think it's really interesting. We are in an age where technology allows us to connect, to influence one another for good and bad at the time when many of the solutions that we have to fixing things aren't even really technological in the first place. So my understanding of kind of the question that you're asking is in many ways, I think, represented somewhat by the faith that the defense community often has in our ability to out-innovate an adversary. Third Offset, for example, was predicated on a free and open society being more innovative than a closed one. I don't buy that. I believe that authoritarian societies have their own forms of innovation. People who had to get cheese in Moscow in the 80s or jeans were incredibly innovative, just in a different way than people like Bill Gates. So there are different cultures of innovation. I think how you harness them and understand them and use them for national will, or let's say call it good, I think matters incredibly. But the larger kind of city on a hill values. The other day I was flying down from Logan to Baltimore and read John F. Kennedy's inaugural address because it was on the wall in the airport. Which is, and when I go to the Kennedy School occasionally, you know, his quotes are everywhere. And I think it's a really important check-in with the kind of rhetoric that we have seen used to align America around really difficult problems, both scientific and strategic, that we overcame. And also to do so in a way that reflects our values, whether it's civil rights and freedom around the world in a manner that I think can be attractive in the 21st century as it has been before. Sure.
August, Bill Hamlet from Proceedings. I've got a question for you that's a short tweet. What question would you have asked this morning's panel?
That's a great question. I thought he was going to critique me on my grammar, which is terrible. What I really liked towards the tail end of the panel was what next, and I think that's the question fundamentally that I would want to know. If we are at a point where we've made a national decision to consolidate our international alliances with the belief that we will benefit more economically and then, in select cases, politically, domestically, does that put us in a position of strength or weakness vis-a-vis our allies when it comes to thinking through the unthinkable here, like a conflict with China? The wars of the last 25 years have been coalition operations. The wars of the future will be coalition operations. One of the really difficult things in Ghost Fleet was thinking through who would not be on our side. Who will the Chinese have carved off and keep on the sidelines? Not an outright hostility to the American cause, but passivity, I should say, not pacificity, is incredibly damaging in this globally interconnected world when it comes to big wars. So would NATO have any obligation as a community to align strategically with the US in the Pacific, irrespective of what the black letter aspects of the treaty say? That's a much more open question, I think, than it was 18 months ago. That's an incredibly important one strategically into the future. I kind of answered my own question. I'd rather ask the panel, but that's what I would like to ask them. Please.
Commander Chris Nelson, Office of Naval Intelligence. My question is, how would you compare and contrast Chinese science fiction with American or English science fiction? And beyond, say, the three-body problem trilogy, do you have any recommendations on good Chinese science fiction?
Yes. This is a really difficult question because I only read English translations of Chinese science fiction, but thankfully there are some excellent versions out there, including the Three-Body Problem trilogy, which some of you may be aware of. It's written by Liu Cixin. It depicts the really, really big risk of an alien species coming to wipe us out, not in light speed, well, I guess light speed, but not in like next week, but 200 to 300 years in the future, and what that does to humanity and how we respond and prepare. So each book in that trilogy deals with almost a different facet of the response because it follows chronologically. So what you're dealing with in this world is the perspective of the strategist, the perspective of the Communist Party, of global leaders. So Liu Cixin has a new book called Ball Lightning out, which I would recommend as well. I've not finished it, but it's fascinating because it's literally a novel about defense acquisitions. It's about the idea to weaponize ball lightning. That's a superficial level. But beneath that, it's really about our kind of human, affection is maybe the wrong word, but our why we're constantly drawn to war and the tools of war and why we invent destructive capabilities. It's a very profound book, like Three-Body Problem, and I'm just starting to understand it myself. So I would say that would be a really good book to read right now because it's just out. There's a science fiction anthology of Chinese sci-fi called Other Planets, which is very good as well, that I would recommend for stories that aren't necessarily even defense relevant or military in their constructs, but are just really great perspectives of reading with a diversity that many of us don't often do. I mean, just making time to read, of course, is hard. When someone reads Ghost Fleet, and my biggest fear is I'm going to feel like I wasted their time. They can disagree with how I portray the Communist Party's evolution into the directorate or what sea combat will be like, but the last thing I want to do is waste somebody's time. And especially in this Fickett construct, you need to be kind of mindful of that too. There's a writer, American writer, who does his own work but also translates, named Ken Liu. And I look to him for a lot of inspiration in terms of what I should be reading when it comes to Chinese science fiction, because he's one of the best translators out there. He translated Three-Body Problem. He's a friend as well, but is somebody who I think is a good marker for that. There's a larger awareness too of the importance of reading more globally in science fiction, a diversity of voices that transcends just how we kind of consider those communities in our own country. It's a great question.
Thanks.
Please. So the really great question for all my discourse on technology, what about the absence of technology? Wouldn't the Chinese target our civilian infrastructure that runs everything from the banking system to just-in-time logistics and retail, et cetera? And the answer is absolutely. And that's in many ways what Ghost Fleet's about. How do we respond when our technological foundation to the society has just been eroded? It's really difficult. It's a cultural and almost anthropological kind of change, or if that's the right way to say it, as it is an engineering fix. But I do believe that we are resilient enough in these different sectors because we are a free and open society that you'll see people step up. One of the things I think that Ghost Fleet articulated was that big organizations and bureaucracies are going to be getting in their own way in a great power conflict. And then one of the challenges is then, therefore, how do you harness, for example, the idea of a super empowered individual who's a force for good or is maybe on two sides of a fence? So a space billionaire that has launch capability that the US may not have. What could they do if they had a letter of marque? What would Walmart do in wartime? Think about the logistics footprint of that company globally, if not in the US. And you add in additive manufacturing in the next decade into their economic model, and you have a really interesting question. Undercurrent to that is the international shareholder base too, and sovereign wealth funds that invest, of course, in a lot of major strategically important companies. They have a vote too. So those are the kinds of things that we try to tease out in the book. And the optimist in me, again, who duels with the dystopian inside, says that we would figure out a way, but it wouldn't necessarily come from the Office of Secretary of Defense as a policy mandate. It might come from a Silicon Valley software billionaire who links up with Anonymous to fight Chinese hackers. That the kind of organized military's technological infrastructure is such a big ripe target already, and it's such a big bureaucracy that it may be very difficult to maneuver nimbly in wartime. Question?
Yes, Mike Mann, by the way. I got to apologize up front. I haven't read Ghost Fleet, but I've heard people talk about it. And what I understand is that the Zumwalt-class ships play a pivotal role in the storyline. And I'm curious as to why you chose those ships. And I'm particularly surprised because of your comments about resiliency. And I'm wondering if there's any connection being made there.
It's a good question. Yeah, so the Ghost Fleet has the Zumwalt on the cover, which has made the book really unpopular when it came out with the Army. In fact, I had a friend who was close to the senior Army leadership who was like, everyone's asking, why are they going after our budget? Why are they trying to steal our, attention? Like, this is a pro-Navy book. Thankfully now they actually read the book and moved past the cover. So, but the Zumwalt is in the story, and I'm going to spoil a little bit, but you now have to commit to reading it. It was pulled out of mothballs because it didn't work. So it's in fact about how, it's an answer to a question of what does America do to figure out a way to project strategic power in the 21st century when it does not have the defense industrial base and capability to do so in a way like we did building bombers in Rouge River in Michigan, the Ford plant, or cranking out ships in a shipyard, at a really high tempo. It's a great question to end on. Thank you again for the time. I'm going to wrap up here so we can get to the next phase of the day. But I appreciate you again all for giving me a chance to talk, and thank you for the questions.
Hi, I'm Richard Latour, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine. And Mr. Cole, before you leave, on behalf of the Naval Institute, I want to thank you for your remarks and your time. And here's a token of our appreciation, a copy of The Free Sea by James Kraska and Raul Pedroso.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we take a break and give Graham Allison, August Cole, and James Holmes the opportunity to sign books for you out in the lobby, I would like to recognize the winners of the 2018 Naval History Essay Contest. The contest is sponsored by the William M. Wood Foundation. It is aligned with the theme of this conference. It gave writers the chance to explore how history can inform present and future responses to challenges posed by China's recent rapid ascent. Okay. Third prize goes to Dr. Jonathan D. Ward for his essay, China's Vision of Victory, Military Geography and Maritime Power, from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. Retired Navy Commander Mark Metcalf earned second prize for his essay, Using the Past to Serve the Present, Historical Narrative in China's Maritime Strategy. Commander, can you step down? Not here with us today is the first prize winner, retired Navy Captain Dale Relage. His essay is titled The Chinese Navy's Missing Years. Thank you. We will reconvene at 1:30 back here in the auditorium for our last panel discussion.